Hello, everyone, and welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I'm your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high potency THC, especially on adolescent brain development, mental illnesses, and suicide. We have another special guest with us today, whom I will introduce in just a moment after I go over a couple quick logistics. This session is being recorded. Please share it with your friends and family. Marta has provided a handout in the control panel of the GoToWebinar app where you are now, or on the screen. If you are watching this via video, it's on that page. She will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll answer 15 minutes of questions with me that you ask. So please feel free, as you think of them, to type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar panel. That way you don't forget them. And at the end, I will read them off in the order that they have been received. So without any further ado, we are so honored to have with us today a very famed cannabis researcher, Dr. Marta Di Forti, who is regarded as one of the leading researchers in the world in the field of cannabis and psychosis. She is a senior lecturer in King's College. She's coming to us from London, and the clinical population that she cares for comprises young individuals suffering their first episode of psychotic disorders. In fact, 2/3 of her patient group have used cannabis before their psychotic onset. And fun fact, she happens to be married to the very wonderful Sir Robin Murray. So without any further ado, Marta, thank you for being here, and thank you for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Well, thank you, Laura, for having me with you today. It is really a great pleasure and privilege to be asked to share with you what is my experience, both as a researcher and also as a clinician, as Laura said, working with young people that develop psychosis for the first time, and most of them in the context of cannabis use. So this title is provocative because I spend lots of my time discussing both with the young people I see as a clinician, but also other researchers in the field, if it is cannabis use that comes first, or the people that develop psychotic disorder because they use cannabis are actually predestined to psychosis, and cannabis is just something that follows the distress of the psychotic symptoms. So we'll go through the journey to address this question together. So some of you would be familiar with what is psychosis, but for those of you who have not experienced this firsthand or have not met somebody with psychosis, I'm just going to very briefly remind us all what we mean when we talk about psychosis and psychotic disorder, which is really the clinical presentation. So when we think about the impact that psychotic disorder and schizophrenia is a severe end of the spectrum, we also think about the cost to the individual, to families, and the cost to the health services. And I don't know about US, but in UK, you only get the attention of government when you can demonstrate that something costs lots of money. And this is certainly the case for psychotic disorder. In terms of the individual experience, so these are some big nets that have actually been created by young people with the experience of psychosis that really depicts what they feel like. And the most common experience, or if you like, the most common experience of psychosis associated with cannabis use is the one of impact on belief, on the way people perceive their environment. And their environment becomes threatening. They feel that they are not safe any longer. They become very suspicious. They believe to be at the center of a conspiracy. And if you want to use a general term, they become paranoid and they develop delusions. So these are not just sensation or fleeting ideas. These become very sort of stable and consolidated belief, which we call delusion, which are actually unshakable even against the evidence of the contrary. Often I have a conversation with my patients when I say to them, well, you're saying to me that you feel that when you are in the street, people are looking at you, and the reason they do that is because they want to attack you. And I try to discuss with them if they can consider an alternative explanation to their belief that they are actually at the center of a conspiracy. And for them, it's almost impossible to look at alternative reasons to what they believe at that point in time. And as you can imagine, if the outside environment is so threatening, you're more likely to withdraw yourself from social contact, including from your family, and to really spend most of your time often confined in your own room. And sometimes the room becomes the only space you can tolerate. And this is also the example of a young person who believes that there are microchip and there are gadgets that are hidden all around the room to spy upon him. And I have young people who barricade literally themselves in their room. Together with this change in belief and perception of the environment, there are also changes in what are all the modality of the five senses, so touch, vision, and auditory perception, and even taste and smell, and all the environment can be altered. And so sometimes these people hear voices when there's nobody around talking to them, they smell smells that don't exist, and they experience touch when nobody actually is touching them. So they have this abnormal perception which come along as absolutely real to them, like my voice sounds real to you right now. So this is of course something that can have a profound impact on the life of anybody, but especially when it happens in young adults, which for instance are beginning their academic, they're about to complete their academic life journey, they're beginning to develop the most important relationship of their life, they are consolidating social network, perhaps even moving into employment. So why is cannabis relevant to all of this? Well, there is now a very extensive literature which has been summarized in 3 meta-analysis, which is the way in research we put together all the studies that have looked at a specific question, in this case, the association between cannabis use and later the development of a psychotic disorder, that do point at this association as a causal association. And in particular, the latest meta-analysis has done something quite different and very important. And I'll tell you why I say that. Most of the initial literature that looked at the question, does using cannabis increases the risk of then developing a psychotic disorder, based the analysis on data where young people were asked, have you ever used cannabis, yes or no? Now, you're not able to answer to me if I ask you a question, but if we were able to have a conversation and I did ask you, have you ever used alcohol in your lifetime? I would expect probably most of you would say yes. But this would give you me no idea of what is your risk of developing a liver disease, for instance, because by just asking people, have you ever used cannabis, yes or no, you put together those who might have tried it once or twice and stopped with people who have been using every day for a decade. And so what this latest meta-analysis has done is to create a cumulative measure of how much people have used cannabis. So they've looked at all the studies that had been published before who had a measure of amount of use. Some had frequency, some had duration, some had the type of cannabis that people had used. And it was statistically transforming to what you see on the horizontal axis, where it says cannabis exposure. And then they have the odds ratio on the vertical axis, which tells you the really probability of developing a psychotic disorder depending on the amount of cannabis use. And you can see that for each of the line that represent each of the study entered in the meta-analysis, greater is the amount of cannabis consumed, greater is the probability of developing a psychotic disorder, with an overall effect that estimated that for the people who were using regularly cannabis, they had a 4 times increase in the probability of developing psychotic disorder. And when you look at the epidemiology of psychotic disorder, quadrupling your risk of developing the disease is actually a very significant impact on individual risk. So in the context of the development of this research, I set my interest on 2 main research questions. And these are research questions that really come from my interaction with the young people I look after as a clinician. And the first one is really, who are the cannabis users at risk of developing psychotic disorder? And the reason this is important is because when I see these young people, they say to me, well, you're telling me that cannabis has played a role in the development of my illness, but my friends out there are using cannabis and they're not coming to the clinic with psychosis, so it can't just be cannabis. And so one of my initial starting point was, could it be that one of the difference between the one that come to the attention of people like me as psychiatrists and the one they don't is, for instance, the amount of cannabis they use, so how much of cannabis you put in your joint, as you can see in Shakespeare's one, or even more so, the type of cannabis that it's in the joint. And again, to draw the analogy with alcohol, we know that the effect that we will experience by having a bottle of beer would be very different from the one of drinking a bottle of whiskey. And the second question is more an academic one, which usually comes along from colleagues in the research environment who are a bit skeptical about the association between cannabis use and psychotic disorder, who have been saying, well, if there is really a link between cannabis use and increased risk of developing psychotic disorder, we must see in those places where the rates of cannabis use in the population have increased, also an increase in the number of new cases of psychosis, what we call the incidence rates. In the same way, as I'm sure you've heard in the media and you follow this in your country, the debate about certain type of food choices and increasing rates of obesity, or lack of exercise and increased rates of cardiovascular disorder, and in general the relationship between risk factors and an increase of a related disorder. So I will try to show you how with my team we have tried to address these questions. So before I get into the details of my data, I think it's best to introduce you the type of cannabis that we come across in London, because this is relevant to interpreting the results I will be sharing with you. And of course, in the States, you would have different type of cannabis, but I think the overall message will be the same. So if you come to London, and especially if you walk along the streets of Southeast London, where I work, you will come across this type of cannabis or this type of cannabis. And you don't need to be a botanicist to pick up a substantial difference between the two. Not only they look different, but if you were able to smell them or touch them, you will realize that the smell of the one on your right is much more intense. And in fact, he has won the name of skunk, but also it's much more sticky. And this is because it's much more concentrated in the cannabinoids that are the active ingredients of cannabis, which are quite oily. And because of the much higher proportion of fluorescence in the type of cannabis on your right, in the skunk, you also have a much greater proportion of these cannabinoids, including the one that are responsible for the effect on psychosis, as we will see later on. And then you have, and this is the picture to remind you, this is called skunk. And then you have this, which is a soap bar or resin, which we also call hashish. Now, the Home Office in 2008, so now a while ago, and then we repeated the study in 2018, did what we call a potency study. So it took a random sample of cannabis seized by one-to-one search from the general population and analyzed these three main types of cannabis that you will come across in the street of London. So imported herbal or traditional weed on your left-hand side, hashish and skunk. And what they found was that if you came across a sample of skunk, on average, you would be expecting a THC delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol concentration of around 16%. In the traditional weed or imported herbal, this was down to 5 and 6%. And in hash, you will still have a reasonably low THC, around 4 to 5%, but also another cannabinoid was present, which is CBD cannabidiol, which is very important, and we'll see why in a moment. CBD was practically absent from skunk and imported herbal. It's relevant to say that when we talk about THC and CBD in cannabis, we're really talking about 2 out of what now have been described as 144 at least cannabinoids, and we know very little about the remaining 142, but we at least know what to expect from these 2 active ingredients of cannabis, and not the one that we'll be focusing on in the talk. So what I decided to do was to collect data from a large sample of young people who had developed psychosis for the first time, that we will call first episode psychosis cases, and an equally large number of young people from the general population who had not developed psychosis, and they represented a control group. And so with a case control design, I wanted to see if by asking people if there had been what type of cannabis they've been using, I could understand who had the one and most at risk of developing a psychotic disorder. And this is a graph which looks a bit complicated, but it's actually very simple. And all I want you to pick on is the fact that when you move from the left-hand side, from the bar that says never use cannabis with 1 as a number, to your right-hand side, you see that after a little drop, the bars goes up to the one of skunk every day, having the highest, again, odds ratio, which means risk of developing a psychotic disorder. What this graph is really telling us that when I move to asking people how frequently they were using cannabis, but more importantly, what type of cannabis they were actually using, I got closer to those who were more at risk of developing a psychotic disorder. With the one using skunk every day, skunk, remember, is the one with the highest concentration of THC, having a 5-fold increase in the probability of actually developing a psychotic disorder, so belonging to the group of the cases. And this was was valid even when we control for other drug of abuse that we know are linked to psychosis, and also other socioeconomic factors that we know again are associated with psychotic disorder. When I show this graph, people get very excited because they see that if you use hashish not very frequently or even every day, you have less than 1 probability to develop a psychotic disorder. And so they believe that this means hashish is protective towards psychosis. This is not the case. This is only telling you, and is actually not significant, that using hashish, even with daily frequency, doesn't increase your risk compared to non-using cannabis, but is not protective. And in fact, we also need to think about what are the characteristics of the hashish of the people including in this study. And as you remember, this was the only type of cannabis who included, together with THC, an equal amount of cannabidiol. And we'll see why this might make a difference to the effects that you expect when people use it. So when this paper was published, we got lots of fuss from the BBC and the media in UK, and I really hoped that some of the young people in London and surroundings will pay attention. I don't know about the young people, but there is one very important British citizen who took our study very seriously. And so this is our queen. And now when she receives a sample of cannabis as a present, this is not a spoof, this is really the queen receiving a sample of cannabis. She smells it, making sure it's not skunk before give it a go. Fair enough, she's probably beyond the age of risk now for psychosis, but it's still a very sensible approach. The other thing I wanted to do is to see if by asking people what type of cannabis they were using, I could get a sense of how much this would have an impact on the number of new cases of psychotic disorder that we would expect in a specific geographical area. And as you can see, this data suggests that 24% of new cases of psychotic disorder that happen in the catchment area where I work in Southeast London could be prevented if skunk use was abolished. And for me as a clinician, but also for the family of these 24% of young people, this is a very significant change in the risk profile and in prevention, especially because cannabis use remains the most modifiable risk factors for the development of psychosis. Moving on, we use this data on what type of cannabis people use and also how frequently to look at something else which is very important at a clinical level and at an individual level. We know when we talk about psychotic disorder that one of the most important single predictor of how well somebody does with the illness, or if you like, how badly they do in terms of the outcome, is the age of when they first develop their psychotic symptoms, what we call the age of onset of psychosis. And there are many things that can influence how young you develop your psychotic disorder. And one is cannabis use. And in particular, if you look at the bottom box at the right-hand side, you can see this is the group that has used skunk every day. And as you can see, again, in our sample of first episode psychosis, the one who had used skunk every day from adolescence were developing a psychotic disorder 6 years younger compared to the one that had never used cannabis. And this is very important because developing psychosis earlier in life, it's actually a predictor of a more difficult and complex course of illness. And yet again, another important impact on the quality of life for young people who develop psychosis in the context of cannabis use relates to what happens is after developing psychosis, you decide to either continue to use your cannabis or to stop. And what now we know very clearly, and this is actually a meta-analysis, is that young people who develop a psychotic disorder following cannabis use, or even people who develop a psychotic disorder and then decide to use cannabis because they come along some daft advice that suggests that cannabis will chill them, will release their distress from psychotic symptoms, will make them less anxious, means that they will have a much more severe psychotic illness rather than getting any actual relief. And what we now know is that if you continue to use cannabis after the onset of a psychotic disorder, you're more likely to have more severe positive symptoms like the one I described at the beginning. You're more likely to end in hospital frequently and to stay longer when you are admitted to hospital. And this was a meta-analysis, so it looked at several studies, but we wanted to look at this question in our sample of first episode psychosis, which we followed up at 5 years. And we actually showed that those young people who had developed first episode psychosis and then had continued to use cannabis, and specifically that continued to use skunk and every day, were the ones that were much more likely to have relapses, so to become unwell over and over again, and to have shorter breaks where they were well, and also to end in what in UK is psychiatric intensive care. So the severity of the symptoms was so pronounced that they really needed to be in a very confined environment. And again, this is something that can be modified. So we know that if you give people support to stop or reduce their cannabis use, you can make a change to the course of their illness. So we're going to leave London and the data I was able to analyze from this group of young people from Southeast London where I work to see if when we moved away from this specific area, we could replicate the same pattern of relationship between cannabis use and risk of psychosis. This is a study that was done before Brexit, and so I always say these are pre-Brexit data. And before we get into the data, what's actually happening in UK right now? This is a picture from the Metropolitan Police, which is showing you, and I don't know how common this is in the States, this is an indoor plantation of cannabis. These are people that convert entire houses into an indoor cannabis plantation with these very strong lights, as you can see. And this is a big net, again, from the Met Police, showing a classic British couple having a cup of tea. And they're looking at the neighbors and they're wondering why the neighbors have got the lights on all night. And the reason is that they not have the light all night because they're awake, but that's because nobody's there except big cannabis plants they are growing under this environmental light pressure. And the Metropolitan Police told me that they tend to do these amazing operation when they spot indoor plantation, usually in winter. And so they circle around some suspected area with an helicopter and they see snow on the roof, snow on the roof, no snow on the roof. And then they will know that when there is no snow on the roof, it's likely to be an overheated indoor plantation of cannabis. And sadly, one of the things that UK now is able to produce independently from the rest of the world is high potency cannabis. And this is because you can easily find in the indication on how to grow it. And we are now saying self-sufficient on our skunk, which might be what saves, sadly, our UK economy after Brexit. But forgetting about Brexit, these were happy times when we could easily collaborate with the rest of Europe. And we were able to develop this amazing study across several EU countries, and you can see them. And within different countries, there were also more than one city that took part in the study. And this is a very important study because not only was able to collect data from young people developing psychosis for the first time and coming to the attention of mental health services in all these different places, but also from people coming from the general population with similar social demographic from the one who had developed psychosis, but who had remained well, what we would call population controls. And we had data on cannabis use, very extensive data on cannabis use, but also on many other risk factors that we could control. And because of the design of the study, we were actually also able to estimate the number of new cases of psychosis that we would expect in these individual sites, part of the study. And we'll see why this was very important for my analysis, this to remind us about the cannabis data. So one headache for me was that when you talk about type of cannabis available in London, we really had three main types. When you talk about working out the type of cannabis that people use across Europe and the potency, meaning the amount of THC, was very difficult. First of all, I had to update the data on London, and this is me in the lab measuring THC in a big bag of cannabis that the Met Police gave me, and that I had to carry in the London Underground to the lab. And I was very worried because it really smelled very strongly of cannabis. Luckily, I didn't meet any drug dogs, and nobody stopped me, and I made it safely to the lab. So I was able to, with colleagues, redo a study to estimate and update measure of what you expect in terms of THC in the London cannabis. And I was able to access data from the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction report, which allow me to divide all the different type of cannabis that people reported to use across Europe in their own language as well, in two main groups. High potency, which is a quite conservative estimate, by the way, with amount of THC equal or higher than 10%, and low potency, anything that had less than 10% of THC. This 10% cutoff, it's sort of an empirical cutoff, which is informed by what we know in experimental study of giving different amount of THC to healthy volunteers and measuring if they develop psychotic symptoms or not. But it's actually a quite conservative estimate. And just to give you an idea, when we looked across Europe, those type of cannabis that went into the low potency type were mostly in, where we had the hashish in UK, then we had mostly the Italian type of cannabis. At the time, there was not much high potency in Italy. And there was only one of the type you can find in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is characteristic actually for having high potency cannabis. We couldn't really have an estimate of the expected CBD in the different times because there were no reliable data. So the potency measure only relies on the amount of THC. And this is a graph that aims to replicate the data I initially showed to you about what happens in South London when you combine a measure of frequency of use with the type of cannabis. Now you won't see hash and skunk mentioned, but you would have, on the contrary, the category of high and low potency cannabis. And you can see that when we look at data in London, we replicated very well what we had found in the previous study, meaning that when you compare the odds ratio, so the probability of developing a psychotic disorder in the people in green, which are the one that use high potency every day, it's 5 times greater than the comparison group, which is the one that never use cannabis, on your right and side. And you can see the same pattern is there for Amsterdam and for Paris. So it replicates across sites. And what is very interesting when you look at Amsterdam, that the odds ratio shoot up to 9. And why is the reason for it? Because when you talk about high potency cannabis in Amsterdam, you're really talking about type of cannabis where the amount of THC is around 30%, 60%. So the impact of this category of high potency is much greater than the one you would expect in London, where really on average the amount of THC is around 16%. So we were reassured by the fact that our London data did replicate beyond the English channel. And we also wanted to see if we were able to use the data on the incidence rates that were part of this study to see if we could explain variation in the number of new cases of psychosis measured for each of the sites of the study, and see what was the contribution of the expected difference in how much cannabis there was in the general population. So this yellow line going up and down is telling you that when we measure how many new cases of psychosis per 100,000 were present in these 11 sites out of the study, there was significant variation, with London having the greatest number of cases. Then you had Cambridge going down, and then again up in Amsterdam, and then going slowly down around Spain, and then again up in Paris. Then Italy had lower rates, and we also had a site from Brazil that contributed. And this is telling us that even when you take into account things like age, gender, and minority status that we do know have an impact on variation in incidence rate of psychotic disorder, you still find what here is a fourfold variation. And so we wanted to see if we could understand why there was this variation by plotting this data against how we expect the proportion of people that use high potency cannabis varies across these geographical areas. And first of all, we looked at what happens when we take into account people that use cannabis every day, because we know that also frequency is important. And so here in green, you have a line that is telling you the proportion of people in the general population in these different sites that are using cannabis daily. And what is quite striking, you can see this green line is going up and down quite nicely with the yellow one, telling you that when there is lots of daily cannabis use in the general population, you also get more cases of psychotic disorder. And this is what we call a significant correlation. In fact, it's a quite high correlation. You have a perfect correlation when R, which is the number you see in the box, is 1, and we're pretty close because it's 0.8. And you can see that the two sites with the highest rate of psychotic disorder are also the one with two of the highest proportion of daily use in the population. What about using high potency? Again, we looked if the proportion of people in the general population that were using high potency would explain the number of new cases of psychosis. And here again, the green line, which represents how many people in the general population are using high potency cannabis, goes nicely up and down with the yellow line, again with a correlation coefficient of 0.7. What is important to say, people sometimes ask me, but is the group of people that uses daily the same that uses high potency? No. When you look at the correlation between these two variables, it's quite high because there is a significant proportion of people that use high potency that are also using on daily basis. But there are also people that are using daily and they're not using high potency, and people that are using high potency and they are not using daily. And these two graphs are really giving you the independent effect of high potency on number of new cases of psychosis from daily use and vice versa. So high potency and daily use independently from each other have an impact on risk of psychosis, which if you think is quite intuitively simple to grasp, because high potency and daily use are both a measure of amount. You can get lots of THC to your brain because you use very frequently or because you use high potency. So moving on, I wanted to see how this data across Europe, again, using the population attributable fraction, which I show you for London, so the proportion of these new cases that we could attribute to cannabis use, and therefore that we could abolish if we abolish, for instance, daily use, or in this case, high potency cannabis. How did it vary across the main European sites? And here you can see that in the old sample, if we had abolished across the whole of Europe high potency use, the PAF, the population attributable fraction, is telling us that we could have prevented 11% of the new cases of psychosis. And this 11% is the result of how different high potency use is available, or is, if you like, prevalent across Europe. Because when you go to London, this proportion of cases you could have prevented if you had abolished high potency goes up to 31%. And very strikingly, in Amsterdam, if you had abolished high potency cannabis, you could have prevented 50% of the new cases of psychosis. Interestingly enough, if you go down to the Italian sites where there is very little, or like in Palermo, practically none high potency cannabis, or at least there was none at the time of the study, we cannot actually estimate the population attributable fraction, because of course, if you don't have high potency cannabis, you can't estimate its impact on how many new cases you could prevent. I'm always proud to say that Palermo is the city where I was born, so at least it's not doing very well in terms of mafia, but at least until recently it was doing very well in not having high potency cannabis. When I publish this data, people from Amsterdam go all up in arms and say, we don't believe that you can explain 50% of all the psychotic disorder we have only on cannabis use. And the reason is that what population attributable fraction is telling us is not that cannabis is the sole cause of psychosis for 50% of the people that develop the illness. What is telling us that of all the different risk factors that people bring along that are necessary for them to develop the illness, for 50% of them, cannabis was the one that tipped them over the threshold of the illness, and that if we've been able to remove from the cluster of other risk factors cannabis use, they might have not developed the disorder. And again, to give you the example of cardiac myocardial infarct or heart attack, whatever we want to call it, you can get to heart attack by being overweight, by having a poor diet, by having very low, doing low exercise, and having genetic risk factors. And some people might need all of them, some people need fewer, but often in prevention, what do? We take out of the equation the one that we can prevent, like doing more exercise and improving your diet. And this can have a significant impact even on those people who have genetic, for instance, predisposition. And so you can think that this 50% of people that you could have prevented from having a psychotic disorder in Amsterdam are the one for whom, if you had removed from the equation high potency cannabis use, you could have prevented them from developing the illness. So what have we learned from this pre-Brexit journey across the EU? We learned that the way people use cannabis, so the type of cannabis they choose and how frequently, has a significant impact on how likely they are to develop a psychotic disorder, and that the type of factors, frequency and potency, are consistently the same across Europe. So when there is lots of high potency and frequent use, you get the same effect across different European cities. And that, I already said, daily use and high potency are the two main drive. And also we saw that these two pattern of use, high potency use and daily frequency, does explain the amount of psychotic disorder you expect in a specific area that could be prevented if daily use and high potency was abolished. So why potency should be so important? Why the amount of THC you have in a type of cannabis is so relevant, and why perhaps the CBD that was present in the type of cannabis that people use in the London study made a difference when they use hashish rather than skunk. Because these two cannabinoids have a very different effect. We now know from lots of experimental study that THC has an impact on a receptor that we have in the brain called CB1, cannabidiol receptor, and has the ability to impair attention, memory, and learning, but also to precipitate paranoid ideas, so psychotic symptoms and hallucination like the one in the vignette at the beginning of the talk. On the contrary, cannabidiol, CBD, does not produce psychotic symptoms, might relieve anxiety, and has also the ability to antagonize the negative effect of THC. So if you have CBD and THC in the same type of cannabis, you might not get the negative effect of THC or the full blown of this negative effect. And what we know as well from the plant is that if you have a plant that produces lots of THC genetically, it will not be allowed to give you the same amount of CBD. So lots of THC usually equates to low CBD and vice versa. And this is because in the plant, THC and CBD come from the same precursor. And this is why in skunk, where you get lots of THC, you end with very little or no CBD. So why are we really sure that these two types of cannabinoid have a differential effect? Well, this is one of the many studies that comes from our institution. This is a Dr. Paul Morrison that shows you that if you give to a group of healthy volunteers who have never experienced psychosis before, but might have tried cannabis once or twice for ethical reason, we can't give THC to people who are completely cannabis naive. And if we give them intravenously, in one occasion, placebo together with THC, and you can see this is the group with the square, we are able within half an hour from giving them the THC by injection to induce in them psychotic-like experiences that you can measure on the y-axis by this scale. And then luckily the psychotic symptoms disappear. If you can ask them to come back again in a different occasion and you give them this time together with the THC, no longer placebo but CBD, you find that they do not develop to the same extent the psychotic symptoms they had developed in the first occasion. And this is to do with the fact that CBD is able to reduce the ability of THC of precipitating psychotic symptoms. And this, as I said, has been replicated in many studies. So one other point I wanted to touch before we get close to closure is that some of you might follow the literature that has suggested that the link between cannabis use and psychosis is all to do with the fact that people who develop psychosis because they use cannabis have got lots of schizophrenia genes, so they have a high predisposition from a genetic point of view to develop psychosis. And it's this predisposition to psychosis that drives them to cannabis use. And then you get the association between cannabis use and psychosis, but these were people destined to develop psychosis anyway. First of all, I don't like the concept of destined, because when we can modify our environment, and this is the case for many mental disorders, we can actually change our risk profile. But let's see specifically what we can show in relation to this question. And this suggestion of the link between the genetic of psychosis and cannabis use comes from this study that you can look up from the endnotes that with Laura we have prepared. So what did we do with the data that we had available? So we wanted to test, first of all, are there differences in the amount of schizophrenia genes that people who develop psychosis without cannabis use have compared to the people that develop psychosis following cannabis use? In simple words, is there any evidence that the one that use cannabis and then develop psychosis have got more schizophrenia genes than a control group? And then, is there any evidence that if you have lots of schizophrenia genes, you're more likely to use daily or use high potency, given that we know these two ways of using cannabis are the one with the highest risk? And then we wanted to see, does the schizophrenia polygenic risk score, that is a way to summarize how many genes of schizophrenia you have, tell us who are the cannabis users at greatest risk to develop a psychotic disorder? The next slide is just telling you that in the sample we had, which is the one you become familiar, the one across Europe, we had a quite mixed ethnic population. And when you do genetic study, you can't just put together people of different ethnic background. So we could only do this analysis on this group you see circle, which is the one of European descent. And I'm happy to answer questions on this topic. And this is the sample we did the analysis on. So the first question is, do we have any evidence that cannabis users in the general population from our study have higher schizophrenia polygenic risk score, which means have got more schizophrenia genes than the one that never use cannabis? And the answer is no. This is a graph to show you that each block represents the two groups. So the block on your left indicates the people that never use cannabis, and the one on your right, people who have used cannabis at some point. And this indicates on average how many schizophrenia genes they have, and you can see that they're practically identical. What if we look at the frequency of use? When we look overall at the frequency of use, going from from left to right, an increase in frequency, you can see that except from one group, there is not really much difference in the amount of schizophrenia genes. And overall, there's not a statistical difference between no using or using frequently cannabis. What about potency? Again, the group on the left is the one of people that never use cannabis, and the group on the right is the group of people who use high potency, with the one in the middle being the one or low potency. And when we look at the contribution of schizophrenia genes in these people, there's no difference across them. This is telling us that people that use cannabis, they use cannabis frequently, and even the one that choose high potency don't have more schizophrenia genes than you and I. I never use cannabis in my life. What if we try to explain the increased risk for psychotic disorder that I shared with you earlier on in the slides, which come along with using frequently cannabis and high potency? What happens if we rerun the analysis, and this time we control for schizophrenia genes? So we take into account the amount of schizophrenia genes that the people who use frequently high potency carry. Even when we remove from the analysis the people with lots of schizophrenia genes, we find that we still have a very significant increase in the probability of developing a psychotic disorder. What this is telling you is that the impact of schizophrenia genes on the risk of developing a psychotic disorder is independent from cannabis use, but equally that the effect of high potency daily use of cannabis is independent of schizophrenia genes. What happens though if you come across people who have lots of schizophrenia genes and also they are using lots of cannabis? It's quite intuitively to imagine that if you combine two risk factors who independently can increase your risk profile, you end with a higher probability of developing the disorder. And this colorful graph is just telling you each of the line represent one of the pattern of cannabis use you have become familiar, a combination of frequency and potency. And on the horizontal axis, you have how the load for schizophrenia genes changes. And you can see that with the increase in load of schizophrenia genes, for each of these pattern of use, you have an increase in your probability of developing psychosis, with the one having the greatest probability is the sort of lilac line, which is the one of those using daily. The bottom line of this slide is that the genetic for schizophrenia has an impact on risk, obviously, of developing the disease, but cannabis use, especially high potency, frequent use, also has an impact, which is not dependent on how many schizophrenia genes you have. You combine the two together, you make the risk profile of the individual greater. Some studies suggest that the best way forward to identify specifically who are the cannabis users that might have a higher risk to develop psychotic disorder is not look at all the set pool of schizophrenia genes that we have described so far, but specifically to go at those genes who have a relevance on the dopamine system, because we know that cannabis has an effect on the dopamine system. So it might be that if you have some genes that make your dopamine system very sensitive to cannabis, you are significantly more at risk of getting psychosis following cannabis use. And these are very preliminary data of the work we're trying to develop. And there are some genes that have a role on dopamine that we have explored, and the plus or minus is telling you how robust the evidence are, suggesting that these genes play a role. But what I really want to show you is the overall message. This AKT1 is a gene that has an impact on how much dopamine we have in the brain. And if you do carry 2 copies of this specific variant of the gene and you use cannabis every day, you can see how your risk of developing psychotic shoots up, indicating that perhaps genes that have to do with regulating dopamine, when they give a particular propensity to produce excessive dopamine when people use cannabis, are the ones that make particular people at risk. But these are very preliminary data, and we are beginning now to understand if there are such genes and which genes this might be. Now, I am running over time, so I don't want to take all the time that we have for questions talking. So I'm just going to touch upon one important topic that for me is very relevant. I don't know how many of you have come across the endocannabinoid system or know what the endocannabinoid system is about. And the reason I want to talk to you briefly about it is because the reason why when people use cannabis, they have such a profound effect is because we do have embedded in our brain and in fact across our body a system called the endocannabinoid system, which develops as early as in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So when we are developing inside our mother womb, that has a very important role in the development of our brain and on our central nervous system from early stages of pregnancy throughout adolescence and even later on in life up to when we die. And this endocannabinoid system consists of receptors, which are all around the neurons in our brain, but also in our liver, in our immune system. And they interact with our neurons, as in this picture, and they do bind to THC. So the key message that I would like to leave you with in relation to the endocannabinoid system is that the endocannabinoid system has a regulatory role in how much dopamine we release in our brain and many other neurotransmitters. And when we bombard the endocannabinoid system with THC by using cannabis, we disrupt the ability of this endocannabinoid system to regulate many functions on our brain. And very importantly, the endocannabinoid system is not active all the time, like our thyroid, which produces hormone all the time, day and night, but is only active on demand, which means that if we are experiencing a stress of our central nervous system, the endocannabinoid system will get activated and will produce the endocannabinoids that I always like to say protects like a safety helmet our brain from injury. So if I develop a stroke or I have a brain injury, my endocannabinoid system will pump up the endocannabinoids and will release a variety of effects and transmission in the brain that shut off everything that could damage the brain and minimize the injury. If I bombard my brain with cannabis and I have a brain injury, or I have a brain infection, or I'm exposed to a significant stress, I will really alter the ability of the endocannabinoid system to protect my brain. So one of the possible theories of how cannabis also increases the risk of psychosis is that if you think about some of the risk factors that some people are exposed before they develop psychosis, like adverse life event, childhood neglect, or being victim of a violent crime or a severe loss. And in the context of all of this, they've been using cannabis, or immediately after they use cannabis, they also prevent their central nervous system to protect the brain from the trauma that they have experienced independently of the cannabis use. And this is why keeping the endocannabinoid system healthy is a way to make sure that we have a healthy brain and we can control the risk that we might have accumulated for psychosis by other exposure to other risk factors. And this is what worries me about the publicity that cannabis as a medicine has received, first of all, in the US and now also in the UK. And as a clinician, I will just conclude with these last two slides. I'm very worried because if I think about aspirin, you're all familiar with aspirin. We can buy it over the counter over the world. We all know what to expect from aspirin. We know the indication where we should take it, but we also know very well all the adverse effects. And we know the dose of aspirin that you should prescribe depending what is the effect, the therapeutic effect that you're seeking. And we know the interaction. And for instance, we know that if a child or an adolescent has got fever, you never give them aspirin because you can provoke this Ray disease, which is a very serious encephalitis that can lead to death. So we can manage aspirin safely, even if it can have side effects. Can we do the same for medicinal cannabis? Well, if you ask me, and I'm actually prescribing a cannabis preparation right now in my clinic, the answer is no, or in very, very rare cases. We now know in some cases of severe epilepsy in children, you perhaps can do this safely, but certainly no in the way it has been prescribed widely in many contexts, where cannabis is proposed as a cure to pretty much everything, sadly, recently even for COVID. And the reason we need to be careful about medicinal cannabis because we still know very little about how to control the adverse effect, how to measure the adverse effect, and also the interaction with other drugs, and what is the ideal dose of THC or CBD or a combination of the two that should be prescribed for different possible indication. And so are we really prepared to prescribe medicinal cannabis not only therapeutically but also safely, as we know for other drugs that come along with the side effect? And my answer as somebody who does that is I think is very early days. So what next? We've got much more research to do, and this is what's keeping me busy. And to try and do my research better, but also to look after the people that come to my clinic, we have developed a cannabis clinic. And this is something that we have developed because of the demand from families. So my advice to you is, if your young loved ones are using cannabis and you're worried about them and you're getting access to the service you need, shout for them, because clinicians can give you support and they can develop service to help them. And we have done that with very little funding. So if we can do it, anybody can do it. So thank you for your attention.
Wow, wonderful. We need a clinic like that here. I know there are so many clinicians, doctors, therapists who still don't believe that there is any harm. Unfortunately, they can continue to use. Marta, I am so grateful for your wisdom, and there are so many questions. Do you have some extra time?
No, I'm very happy to stay with you because it's my fault. I went over.
No. I can't imagine one single thing that you said that everybody did not want to hear. That's no problem at all. I just want to be respectful of your time. Okay, well then let's start at the beginning. In your finding for AKTI, showing the very strong effect for susceptibility to cannabis-induced psychosis, are you regularly screening patients for this gene of risk, and do you think it is a reliable enough predictor to use for screening purposes?
So I start from the last point. The answer is no, because it's not being consistently replicated. And because of that, we cannot justify doing a screening for two reasons. One, we don't have the funding. You know, we work in an NHS setting. So because the evidence are not yet robust, we cannot justify using NHS funding to do routine screening. And also in some way, you also have to think about the ethical implication, because if I'm not sure that this is a reliable screening and I find somebody to have the variant that in theory doesn't increase the risk, am I really confident I can say to people, go get along with your cannabis and don't worry about it? No, I'm not. So this is the reason we're not doing it. What we're learning about cannabis and the genes to do with psychosis and cannabis is that it's very likely there's going to be many of them. And so it's more likely that we will get to a screening point where we have a score of dopamine genes, not just one. And that would probably be a more reliable way to screen for people. And this is where my research is going, is sort of moving towards right now with the funding we recently got from the MRC. So hopefully we can reconvene again in 5 years' time, and I'll be able to tell you if we find some reliable way to screening people.
Oh, we would love that. And you can come back anytime next week. By the way, we have a lot of comments on how much we're enjoying your kitty in the background.
You can see him better, so you can see us both.
Yes, he's been quite entertaining walking across the back.
I can't see myself, as you know, when I speak, so I didn't notice that he was patrolling up and down.
He's so cute. We probably have 5 responses here about your cat. Let's see, from the illustrations in the beginning that you showed with the individuals experiencing psychosis, one reader wants to know, or watcher, is this from a novel? These are so good. Are these available for purchase for them to use in their presentations?
You are very welcome to use them from my presentation. I know my presentation will be available to you through the website, and so you can do whatever you like with them. And if you need a format that allows you to use them, because these are vignettes that have been created by people with lived experience, so you can use them as much as you like. So they're not part of a formal publication. These are where young people have wanted to describe their experience.
Wow, they're very powerful. Dr. Di Forti, will you please come to Colorado and please lead research here? It is frightening that we have 80 to 99% THC potency products with our concentrates, which I know you have heard of, and they're legal here in Colorado. And we just passed a bill, Colorado House Bill 1317, trying to regulate some of these concentrates, especially trying to keep them away from 18 to 20 years old. But how would you, I guess, extrapolate the effects from what you measured with, you know, the 10% and over 10% and skunk being 16%? If you extrapolate that, how much more likely then would you see psychosis with these very high level potent concentrates?
So I guess my experience also as a clinician is that it is not often helpful, neither for me or for you, to extrapolate.
Okay.
Because sometimes when this is in pharmacology, this is a general concept.
Sure.
Sometimes when you increase the amount of a pharmacological compound, you have a linear increase. So, you know, if we're talking about 10% and you're telling me about 90%, we could simply multiply 9 times the risk and say, well, I expect to be 9 times greater because you have 9 times more THC than the people in my study. But we also know that sometimes pharmacological compound like THC don't behave that way. So it might be that when you go above a certain amount, you have you multiply the effect. So it's much greater than you expect. Or it might be that when you get to a certain critical level, I don't know, 40%, you plateau. So you get such a dreadful impact that you can't go any worse. So the only way to know an answer to your question is to study that in a group of young people who have actually reached a regular consumption of high THC as the one you have in Colorado. Now, I would be surprised if you can maintain a healthy brain if you use on daily basis 80% THC. Talking to colleagues who are in Colorado, they sometimes say that when people use these high strengths, they titrate. So they never use as much as the people I see, because otherwise they get off their mind too quickly and they don't like it. On the other hand, if young people are beginning to have access to this high potency, my experience of young people don't titrate. Young people just use stuff because they do it with their peers, because they experiment. And so I fear what we might see is the effect on young people who are naive to cannabis and for the first time they try 80% of THC. And again, colleagues from Colorado are telling me that they're more likely, these young people, they're more likely to end in accidents and emergency because they're so in acute distress that they have to be seen by a physician in I&E rather than the people I see who don't normally come by I&E. They come from a different route of referral. And I would love to come to Colorado, but you have to arrange for me to come with my 3 cats and my dog. So it might not be very easy.
I think we could arrange anything. You know, we can do that here at Johnny's Ambassadors. I think you're going to be exactly correct. And in the research that we just funded here in Colorado, $1 million to not only do a meta-analysis, but to try to look at some of the gaps that we have with our concentrates in an effort to recommend a cap for THC potency. I think for adolescents will be incredibly important. My son Johnny started at the age of 14, and you know, in 5 years became psychotic and had used the high potency. And we have many doctors here who tell us about every day their experiences in the emergency room with young people, teenagers coming in to the emergency room with acute psychosis. And so it's really good. It's important to understand your research in that if they can stop, if they will forever be sober, and know that they cannot use again, it's encouraging to at least see that there is a chance for them to recover.
And again, we know we've done this with tobacco in some way very successful. I mean, we know how you can impact on rates of lung cancer if you get the general population to smoke less. And we've been able to get, both in the US and in Europe, the rates of people smoking tobacco much lower. And we've done this by education, and we've done this by giving an alternative to smoking tobacco. And I think we're so far away with cannabis, both with alternatives and also with education, at least in UK and in Europe. So it's something we can modify, and it really frustrates me when I don't see this happening as much as it should. And if you know doctors who have data and want some help in analyzing it, I collaborate with lots of young researchers in my team that would love to analyze the data for them or with them.
Wow. And our university here has been tasked by our legislature to conduct that research. So I certainly would love to make some of those introductions. That would be amazing. What about CBD? You mentioned CBD. Can CBD be used on its own as a treatment to help with those who are trying to stop using marijuana? Have you used CBD alone?
So the answer, I start with the first part of the question. It's there are very promising data suggesting that, forget for a second psychosis, the CBD reduces the dependence that you develop once you use cannabis. So that could be used to help people who are using cannabis with THC in it to reduce their cannabis use or even stop. So a little bit like a drug that you give to reduce the craving, to reduce the sort of withdrawal symptoms. So as an anti-cannabis dependence drug. And there is one of my colleagues he works at the Buff University that is about to start a trial with people who use cannabis, and is going to give to one arm of the study CBD alone, and to the other one treatment as usual, to see if the experimental data that have been accumulated in real-time trial data show that CBD is an effective compound to help people reducing and stopping using cannabis. Wow. Have I been able to prescribe it? The problem is the CBD, I can't prescribe CBD on the NHS to help people to stop reducing cannabis, because pure CBD is extraordinarily expensive and my trust is not very generous. I've been able to use some of my own research money to prescribe a medication which we have available in UK for something different. It's used for multiple sclerosis and it's called Sativex. I don't know if it's licensed in US. Sativex has a very small amount of THC, 2.7 milligrams, and the same amount, 2.5, well, a little bit less, of CBD. So it has the one-to-one ratio of THC and CBD of the old-fashioned hashish. So what I've been able to do with the young people I see that want to stop using cannabis is that I've been allowed in a small group of them to prescribe Sativex. And what they do, they substitute the Sativex, it comes like a spray, with the joint. And I had on 20 people very successful results in 15 of them who have come off. I mean, one of them had been using cannabis for 10 years, 15 joints a day, and gradually switching from the high potency to Sativex had gone down to 10 and transformed a life. Now, these are few cases, so I'm hoping to get money to do a trial. So hopefully we will be able to have more of these safe cannabis preparation that people can be given, like you do when you do tobacco cessation strategy, when you people coming down. Exactly. So, but early days, hopefully we'll be able to do that.
Wow, that's so promising and so needed here, especially with our very high rates of addiction and addictive potential, especially of the concentrates. Even our flower here, Marta, some of our botanists brag that they have cultivated upwards of 35 and 40% THC in some of their strains. It's very difficult to even buy anything herb that's less than 18% here in the US. So the addiction rates are incredible, and it's very hard to stop. There's significant withdrawal. It's painful.
And I think that it's great ignorance actually on the dependence component of cannabis. So there is lots of research, I have to say, on cannabis and psychosis, that people believe it or not is a different story. But there's much less on cannabis dependence and cannabis withdrawal. So young people don't think that they become dependent on it. They know they will become dependent on alcohol. They know they will become dependent on tobacco. They might know about opiates, especially you had lots of campaigns on opiates. But there is this idea that with cannabis, you can stop anytime. Cannabis can give very unpleasant withdrawal symptoms, and you can really get hooked on it, even if you really want to try and stop.
Yes, and I think that's one of the false narratives that people believe with legalization and, medicinal medication, cannabis, that it's somehow safe, that there's this running a line that, hey, it's just weed, it can't hurt you. But that was back in the 80s when it was what, 2% THC, and even then people had psychosis. So I think that is a key part of our work, and what you're doing is just to raise the awareness of the potential harm in using it and on the brain development. Have you done any sort of cross correlation? I know you mentioned with the frequency of use and the potency of the product. What about also the age of onset? If you add
Yeah,
that data in,
we
14,
have
16, 18.
So we have looked at that, and we looked at the critical age is really starting at age 15 or younger. So people that start age 15 or younger, they really push up the risk further. But what is
Okay.
interesting is that when you look at the age of use, what you need is to combine the age of use with then how long people use. Because if you had started again at age 14, but you've only used 3 times, that's not as risky again as having started at age 15 or younger and choosing high potency and using frequently. So these
Yeah.
3 variables go together, and if you like, they have an additive effect. So when you combine them together, you really push up your risk. And I have a student right now that is analyzing data where she's looking at the combination of frequency and potency in 3 age groups. So she's looking at people that start younger than 15 but then stop, with people that start younger than 15 and continue, and with people that start later and continue, to see which of these 3 components really drives the strongest association.
Wow, we will really be interested in hearing the results of that data, or even having your colleague come and present on her
Yeah,
work when completed.
very happy to do that with her, or if she likes to do that, I'll be very happy to encourage her to do that. She's doing a project right now, actually. She's doing
Wonderful.
a dissertation.
Oh, we'd love to see that. Maybe we can have a panel and have Robin on too. That'd be fun.
Definitely.
Okay. Uh, it's been my experience with my son, and from what I've seen, that many of the young men who suffer from schizophrenia are very high functioning, like Johnny, like her son. They're very intelligent, very creative. Why is this? It's so very painful to watch this long, difficult disease overtake their brilliance. Have you noticed that too, Marta?
Yes, and actually what we have noticed, and there is a study that we did with one of our PhD students that shows that, in fact, the young people who develop psychosis in the context of cannabis use, they are clever, they're sociable, they're talented, and they were doing very well until they started using cannabis.
Wow.
And I think there's been lots of discussion about why, once you develop psychosis, you don't manage to function as well as you were before. Well, one, of course, the experience of psychosis is very stressful, but also it has an impact at different level on your confidence. I mean, once you experience your outside environment as so threatening, even if you're very clever, it takes a long time for you to redevelop trust with people around you, would be able to go back to study and be in a classroom with others, or to feel that if you try to get a job, people will be nice to you. So that's a long journey, even if you take out of the question cannabis. But
Wow.
my experience is that if you do take out of the way cannabis, because this is a group of young people who are clever and they are resourceful and they would have done very well, don't give up on them, because with the right vocational support, psychological support, they can get there. They might not necessarily live up to the expectation you as a family or they had when they were 15, but they can still do very well. And I'm saying this because I see young people going back to studies and completing a degree. It might not be a degree in nuclear engineering, it might be a degree in social sciences, but they still get on, they get family, they do very well, and longer they stay well, more they achieve in their life. So don't give
That's
up, doesn't
important.
matter how old they are. That they are 20, 30, 50. As a clinician, I will tell you, never give up, because they will catch up with their potential longer they stay away from cannabis.
That's an excellent reminder. I think so many parents get discouraged, especially when their teens turn 18 and leave the house and say, it's not harming me, it's not me, it's you, and they don't want any help. And sometimes the parents just give up because they think there's nothing that can be done, or they don't even know where their child is. They're homeless. somewhere and not communicating with them. So I really appreciate that reminder. Someone commented, so it's so frightening that cannabis now is legal. It's seen as easy breezy and very little is spoken about the different types and rates of use and tragic impacts, and we need to continue educating children about this. Is there any data on the permanence of psychosis remaining after sobriety? For example, 90 days after the intervention of a heavy user. I understand that users who stop can usually return to somewhat normal lifestyle within the curve you just described, Marta. But in other words, is heavy cannabis use permanently damaging to the psyche?
So this is a question that with the studies that have been done so far, we have not yet been able to fully address. And there might be three different groups of people when we get more data. There might be a group of people who get permanent damage, and this might be because they've been particularly susceptible to the effect. The other one is what, Laura, you were suggesting, the time when they started. Now, the brain is very plastic. We know the brain has got great potential to recover, but we also know that if you disrupt brain development, you might be less likely to compensate for it or not entirely compensate for it. So there might be an issue on the permanent damage, which depends on how young you were and also how biologically susceptible you are to its effect. And if you think about this, it's the same with alcohol and liver disease. I mean, you might not be familiar with alcohol and liver disease, but just to give you the example, most people that drink heavily, when they stop, if you monitor the liver, they can go back to a pretty much healthy liver, or if you like, even if they still have some liver damage, the liver that is functioning well can very well compensate, and you can forget about the damage bit. So hopefully for most people, the brain can do the same. So even if you have damage, some area of the brain, the rest can compensate, and so you can go back to a good level of functioning. But if there is a group of people for whom this reversibility is not satisfactory, we don't know, and we don't know yet how to identify them. And these would be the people where we really need to do lots of prevention to make sure they really don't get near cannabis.
When we figure out what that linkage is. And I've heard sometimes that it can take years, right, Marta, for people to recover. To the brain will continue to heal and be plastic until, you know, the mid-20s, even upwards of 30s, and even after that, the brain can recover.
Yes, I mean, again, think about, I don't know if, I mean, most of you would have in mind somebody who might have had a stroke or a brain injury. Even when doctor says you're fine to go home, and you know, usually it doesn't mean that you have recovered. Most will remain with some sort of inability to move or difficulty to think and speak, and longer you do your rehabilitation, more your brain creates new connection and more is able to return to even normal or better. I mean, I suffer a severe brain injury now 12 years ago, and I had my left side totally paralyzed. Now I run every night with my dog. It didn't take 5 weeks. It took 2 years of heavy physio. Wow. And so I'm a demonstration that you can damage badly your brain, but you can recover. But it needs lots of work. And it's the same. We're very good at neurological rehab. We're not very good at psychiatric rehab. We tend to give people antipsychotic. We're happy as long as they don't cause trouble to anybody, and we let them be. Rehab for psychosis is crucial. Getting people to use their brain, getting them to connect again, getting them to do psychology and vocational support, find them a job where they are initially protective and sheltered, and so they can rebuild their confidence and they can thrive as somebody would with a brain injury.
Do you have people come to your clinic from outside of the UK?
So unfortunately, our clinic is, you know this, Laura, yourself, is funded by charity, very little initial funding. And yes. Right now, we're only allowed to accept referral from our local trust, just because we are really, we don't have enough resources. But hopefully, what I would like, if our model proves successful, there's no reason why clinicians that work in Colorado can't do that, because I don't have expertise that your colleague don't have. I've put together things that we know work. I haven't invented anything, so anybody can do that.
Excellent. I would love to see some partners in that area because it's much needed. Parents are often desperate, not knowing where to send their young adults or get them help. Okay, just a couple more questions. I'm watching my time. Do you have a sense of what milligram of THC per day translates into an increased risk for psychosis?
So the question of milligrams is very important because there's been very little research in translating what we are discussing in terms of potency into milligrams, except there's beginning to be some consensus, and I can share with you, Laura, and I apologize, I should have done it before the talk, but I had a busy week, but
I can send it out.
To be, thank you, some consensus on, can we develop units for cannabis in milligrams which do the same the units for alcohol have been telling us about harm and controlled use. So there is some consensus that 5 milligrams of cannabis across the different types would be the equivalent of a unit of THC, of a safe sort of unit of THC. So anything below 5 milligrams of cannabis is less likely to be associated with harm in terms of psychosis, dependence, and cognition. But this is a preliminary work, and there's not been international consensus yet. But I can share with you the paper that refers to this work, and is the work of my colleagues Tom Freeman, who has been collaborating with Canada, because Canada has been quite keen on making available type of cannabis with the milligram specified, and having this in with an explanation of a unit threshold for risk.
And that was the number just adopted here in the United States as well as a measure.
Yeah, there you go. So there is some science behind it. It's not a random number. But I think the international consensus has not yet agreed. But I can send you, Laura, the paper that Tom actually came to give a talk about this to our peer group, where the young people with psychosis and cannabis use they attend every Tuesday, and talked exactly about this Tuesday. So that's why it's fresh in my mind.
Oh, would love to get that and send that out and share that as well. And in Colorado, one serving size of THC in an edible is 10 milligrams. So there you go. That shows you. And of course, one gummy bear at 50 THC, there's 5 servings. What are you going to just eat a piece of it? So it's really difficult.
Nobody's going to do that. I mean, nobody eats a piece of a gummy bear.
Yes. Is there any value to studying the brains of those with schizophrenia after death? Do you know if that's done?
Yeah, this has been done there are lots of post-mortem studies of people with schizophrenia. One problem of doing that is, although people with schizophrenia tend to die 20 years younger, sadly, because of the comorbidity, not necessarily because of the schizophrenia, than the general population, you also have to think that because schizophrenia is likely to develop in adolescence or early 20s, and people die in their 40s or 50s, is still a long time of illness, with these people having received lots of medication, having had a very unhealthy lifestyle, forget about even cannabis, smoking, unhealthy eating, low exercise. So when you look at the brain, you do see the effect of the illness, the actual illness itself, but also you see the effect of all this stuff we've been discussing. And so how you disentangle what is actually just the pure illness from everything else that has accumulated over time is very difficult. So post-mortem studies have not been as helpful as we thought, unless you look at very young people who died at the very beginning. And of course, there's very little work on that because luckily there's no high mortality in this group.
Got it. Wow, fascinating. Okay, last question. And there are several who are related to this about kids being brainwashed by marijuana advocacy groups. They're being lied to. They don't really tell about the general health issues. Do you have success convincing an adolescent user that marijuana is harmful? How do you get them to change your behavior when they believe the lies that the marijuana industry is telling them, especially when they turn 18 and now we have no control over them? How do we get them to listen to us that they can develop psychosis and that it can cause harm?
So my personal experience is that having a doctor like myself telling adolescents what they should do or not to do, or what they should believe or not believe, doesn't work. And this is why I've adopted the approach of peers. So I don't tell them what to do. I invite them and make available to them this peer group where they are, lots of them, many of them very fond of cannabis. And I don't tell them cannabis is either bad or is good. Together, we listen to experts who come for 10 minutes and tell us what they know about cannabis and harm and psychosis and cognition and attention. And then we have together, and my role is just moderate a discussion. They have a discussion with the guest speaker, and among themselves, they test their belief. They bring up the knowledge that they got from the web, and they sort of, the speaker usually is quite good at challenging them and give them alternative. So the bottom line, I give them an opportunity to consider another source of information together with their peers, where the discussion that they have is not with me, but is among each other, and I only have the role of asking questions if they're relevant to me. And every now and then, we get some young people, again, their peers, who come along and say, look, I was like you. I looked all this nonsense on the web. I listened to their advice, and I ended in hospital 3 times. And then it's just when I stopped using cannabis that I was able to do all the things that we like to do, having fun with friends, getting a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever, going to the cinema, getting on with my education, getting a job, going traveling. And this is the most powerful way. If I just tell them what to do, I don't get anywhere. So I have recently changed approach. So peer groups, if you have a way to create peer groups, and I know, Laura, you do have witness statement or whatever you want to call them, video, people with lived experience, more
Yes.
young people who can share that on a video, on a talk, more celebrities of the young celebrities that these young people look at, they can give their experience. This is the way to get them interested.
I love that. And it's confirmed exactly the direction that we're going in for Johnny's Ambassadors, trying to create teams of people around the US and communities similar to chapters, but really looking at how do we get teens to have an impact panel, to give presentations, and to gather groups of people who are willing to go out into the community and speak. So if you get in trouble with the law for having marijuana, or
exactly.
you are driving under the influence of using marijuana, or get in trouble at school, that one of the things that they would have to do would be go listen to these teens in this impact panel, perhaps once a month, instead of just suspending them from school with a free week of vacation. They actually have to go listen to some people with some lived experience. I think that's going to be very impactful.
And I wonder, it's very easy, if you go on the web, I'm sure it's the same in the US, and you put the word cannabis use, you often get lots of this nonsense, how wonderful it is for you. And I would like to get to a point where if a young person is looking for cannabis on the web, he also gets an advert to a link to a young person telling them, look what happened to me, rather than people having to be pushed into, because sometimes when they get pushed into looking at this video, they've already got close to trouble. But I don't know how we can do that, but it would be great if we could do that, and we could collaborate at doing that.
We have lots of people who are willing to share their testimonies. We had a huge group of teens who went to the Capitol in Colorado and testified about how the use of marijuana had impacted them. So I think we are getting to that point where we can start to share some of those stories and have that peer-to-peer conversation of teens saying, don't do this, it totally messed me up. And I am so glad to hear you say that, and wish I could be a little fly on the wall in some of the meetings that you're having
You
with
can
these.
come. You're very welcome to come. I mean,
Don't say that, you know I'll come.
you and I can work out the time, but we can exchange. But you'd be more than welcome to come.
Oh, I would love that. Well, we have generously taken a half hour extra of your time. Thank you.
My
for
pleasure. Thank you for putting up with me for an extra half an hour.
This has been amazing. I'm so grateful for you and honored again, and appreciate you and Robin having given so freely of your time.
And our cat.
Your baby there. That's a perfect way to end. And everyone is saying, fantastic, wonderful, wonderful, great presentation. I want to come too. So with that, we will say thanks to you, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you again.
Bye-bye. Have a lovely day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye, Laura. Speak to you soon.
I hope so.